James, Duke of Monmouth, our hero of this series, has survived a childhood kidnapping, life in exile, the fire of London, the Great Plague, battle, and the charge of murder. From plain beginnings he had come far, to be a privy councillor and the colonel of the household cavalry. He was a handsome, athletic courtier, well known and respected in military and international circles. He should have felt secure. And yet, he was far from it. Despite his father, King Charles II's obvious love and adoration, he did not feel safe, even as the fourth gentleman in the kingdom. Standing behind the king, his uncle the Duke of York and Prince Rupert, he had the Duke of Buckingham and Ormond snapping at his heels. Even with his position of commander of the Life Guards, and therefore the most senior army officer in the land, York and Prince Rupert still held stronger influences in naval and military affairs. Buckingham himself had received a setback in the early days of the Third Anglo-Dutch War. His command, the proposed invasion of Zealand, was given to Prince Rupert. But Monmouth could not see this as an end to the competition to his military aspirations. Gossip at court was ripe, and there was talk that the famous soldier of fortune, the German Count Schomberg, was to be recruited into the army with the rank of Lieutenant General. The Duke of Monmouth, for the time being, would remain in command of the Royal English, still under French command. Whilst keeping a watchful eye on military matters and his fellow officers, he also needed to keep an eye on his extended family, and in particular, the other illegitimate children of his father, who claimed their share of their father's affection. There was Charles FitzCharles, known as Don Carlos, whose mother was Monmouth's mother's successor, Catherine Pegg. Don Carlos was to become the Earl of Plymouth, and was described in 1672 as a finely bred youth with a great deal of wit. There were also the Countess of Castlemaine's children with Charles. There would be Southampton, who would eventually be a duke, plus their brothers Northumberland and Grafton, the latter playing a large part in Monmouth's eventual defeat on the blood-soaked fields of Sedgemoor. Charles's list of sons does not stop here. His flirtations with Lewis de Caraway would produce the Duke of Richmond, and we must not forget Nell Gwynn and her son St Albans. But even with all these children, Charles would show his true colours when addressing his sons. He would address all but one by their titles, for example, Plymouth, Southampton, St Albans, but he would always call his favourite, and his firstborn, James. But as 1672 came to a close, Monmouth's life and position was on the rise. In November, he was appointed Chief Justice in Eyre of all royal hunting grounds this side of the Trent. In the new year, more was to come. In February, he was made Lord High Chamberlain of Scotland for life. These advancements for this impeccable horseman, this sporting Adonis, this Victor Ladorum, meant more money and more power. With political and religious undercurrents flowing about the kingdom, he was to reap even more in the months and years to come. Despite Charles allying himself to the Catholic Sun King, Louis XIV of France, the country was still vehemently anti-Catholic. Charles, like his father before him, seemed to either ignore or be totally ignorant of the general feelings of the public. In March 1673, he published his Declaration of Indulgence for tender consciences. The grand idea was for Charles to increase universal religious toleration. Penal laws against dissenters were to be suspended. Nonconformists were to be offered places of worship, and Catholics, the bogeymen of Protestant England, were to be allowed to worship in their own homes. If Charles thought this declaration would be received with cheers, he was sorely mistaken. Within hours, the mob was out in force with cries of "Down with Popery" and "No to arbitrary government." London was already a hotbed of rumour and dissatisfaction. The Duke of York was already suspected to be a secret papist, and that the king himself would not be far behind. With the French army seemingly easy victories over the Dutch, the king's son under the French king's command, and the king and heir to the throne toying with Catholicism, no wonder the English people were fearful of the French alliance. would Louis XIV soon turn his eyes and his armies westwards? It was not only the English people that were fearful and indeed angry, but it was also Charles's closest inner circle as well. In particular, the newly made Earl of Shaftesbury, the militant Protestant, who was furious to discover that the king had duped him into signing the Treaty of Dover. On top of this, to fan the flames of Shaftesbury's ire, was the knowledge that the king was a closet Catholic. Charles would learn to loathe this popular and rowdy politician, whom he would call Little Sincerity. Shaftesbury would eventually lead Monmouth down a path of opposition, and then to rebellion. But now he was fast becoming the leader of the country or Whig party in Parliament. His first actions were to get the Declaration of Indulgence revoked, which he was successful in, and then disbanding the army. The former goal was soon achieved in March 1673, when the Cavalier Parliament forced the king to cancel the declaration. London rejoiced, for this was one of the biggest royal capitulations of the century. Pressure was continued to be put on the king. 3 weeks later, the infamous Test Act was passed by Parliament. This legislation refused military, political, and courtly positions to anyone who would not take the oath of allegiance and supremacy and sacrament according to the Church of England. This act claimed a very early and high-profile victim, the Lord Treasurer Clifford. He refused to take the oaths, retired to his lands in Devon, and committed suicide. But the biggest bombshell and political scalp was the Duke of York himself. The grand office of Lord High Admiral was put into commission, and Prince Rupert took over command of the fleet. It was at this very point that a split began to emerge between York and Monmouth, between uncle and nephew. For York, due to the Test Act and his conversion to Catholicism, saw his life falling apart. He had lost his father to the executioner's axe, lost the Civil War, lost his first wife, lost his beloved career, and now was watching his position of heir to the throne rapidly drifting out of reach. It is all too easy to see how his mind would become bitter and vengeful as the months and years passed by. But for Monmouth, life was all sunshine with the adoration of the mob and the court. In April of 1673, Monmouth took the test cheerfully at St. Martin's in the Field. One observer described Monmouth as coming up all decently to the rails before the communion table. Monmouth said, "I declare that I believe that there is not any substantiation in the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, or in the elements of bread and wine at or after the consecration thereof by any person whatsoever." James, Duke of York, would have been disgusted by these words. Monmouth, despite being brought up as a Catholic, seemed to have no problem with the words, and no doubt repeated them with a shrug and a smirk. As Monmouth departed the church and progressed down the steps, he was assailed by cries of "A Monmouth! A Monmouth! And God bless the Protestant Duke!" From now on, the royal relations would be split by the mob, the Protestant Duke and the Catholic Duke. But even with this fear of the French alliance and the simmering religious tensions, Charles did not distance himself from his ally, Louis XIV. Monmouth busied himself with recruiting more guardsmen for the Royal English. He took the lull in fighting to reorganise his command, and even persuaded Charles to bring in more Irish. Monmouth was busy on all fronts, and was still lauded wherever he went. The Heroic Life reported, as he came on shore at Calais, he was received by the governor, who waited at the landing place with several persons of quality, and a numerous company of coaches, in which his grace and the gentlemen who waited on him were conducted to their lodgings, which were the richest and noblest in the whole city. And to manifest the honour and veneration they had for his grace, the governor commanded the guards to be drawn up, and all the great guns firing for joy at the same time. King Louis was clearly adamant that Monmouth was a man of military ability, and in January of 1673 appointed him Lieutenant General and Supreme Commander of all the subjects of the Royal English who were in or who would come to France. The next month saw Monmouth, alongside other senior officers of the Allied army, studying Vauban's mighty fortress of Lille. With his already experienced eye, he would have observed and appreciated the proportions of the outer bank, the palisade protecting the covered way, the counterscarp behind it, the outer wall of the great ditch, the rings of demilunes, ravelins, and the detached triangular works which offered close all-round defence. The hornworks or twin salients were in musket range of their neighbours, while the covered way gave shelter and protection to musketeers. These covered ways provided easy access and egress away from the fighting on the walls, but they must have shown to Monmouth that they could also offer a route in for resolute attackers. To cap the defences off, Lille boasted impressive arsenals, powder magazines and barracks, and all protected on the walls by 12 and 16 pounder cannons. So how exactly was the war in the Netherlands progressing? Early in the year of 1673, the broken dykes and flooded areas had caused a temporary ceasefire, yet it was not to last. Louis was demanding action as quickly as possible, and he was ordering a two-pronged campaign. First, to scatter de Ruyter's fleet, Prince Rupert was to lead the English, whilst his counterpart d'Estrées would lead the French. Whilst this was taking place, an invasion of the Zeeland coast would take place by the newly raised army at Blackheath. And second, to besiege, assault, and capture the forbidding citadel of Maastricht. This formidable bastion was vital to Louis's war aims. Alone, it held nearly 8,500 men, double the strength of the 6 fortresses taken by the French the previous year. But perhaps more importantly was its geographical position. With its commanding position on the River Meuse, it controlled important lines of communication between Holland and her imperial allies. Cut those lines, and the French, with their English allies, would be a step closer to victory. It was so important that the leading French generals were kept well away from it. Turenne was to shadow and hold the Austrians on the Rhine, whilst Condé would move against Amsterdam. Louis, the all-powerful Sun King, would have the prestigious prize of Maastricht for himself. But Louis was sensible enough not to assault the city on his own. He would take the greatest siege engineer of the age with him, Vauban. Vauban had revolutionised siege warfare and had moved away from the old-fashioned attack on a single point. An attack which would only mean a small force could be used, large casualties amongst the attackers, whilst at the same time being vulnerable to sorties by the garrison. Vauban had a schedule. First, the city would be surrounded by cavalry and parallels dug, just out of range of the defenders' cannon. This first parallel would act as a covered way. Once this was done, approach trenches would be dug, zigzagging their way towards the city walls. These were purposefully not straight to offer better protection against artillery and musket fire from the walls. The third step would be to create more parallels if necessary. These would allow the movement of troops and supplies around the city without being seen or shot at by the defenders. Once the third parallel had been dug, attacks or saps would be run out to provide placement for snipers, mines, and artillery positions. Once the great guns were in place, the bombardment of selected parts of the wall would begin. This would be a lengthy process, for Maastricht was defended by a strong garrison, 4 concentric walls, and an experienced French commander by the name of Farrier. Against these imposing defences, Louis could muster 26,000 infantry, 19,000 cavalry, and 58 large cannons. Monmouth was once again front and centre, and the heroic life seemed to be most impressed with the royal duke. His Grace, the Duke of Monmouth, marched that day at the head of the infantry, which he did with such indefatigable industry, and managed his command with such soldier-like gallantry that the king took special notice of it, admiring and highly commending the duke's bravery to those who were about his person. We can imagine Monmouth on his magnificent charger riding up and down the lines of tired marching men, exhorting them to keep moving, rebuking some, praising others, posting flank patrols, making sure rations are delivered, and ensuring enemy scouts were kept at an arm's distance. In the first week of June, Louis went ahead with a vanguard of 5,000 infantry and artillery to trace the lines of circumvallation. Trenches around the city to defend against relief attempts for the garrison of Maastricht. 3 days later, the main guard caught up with the king, and a bridge was hastily thrown up across the Meuse. The amount of engineering for a siege in the late 17th century is actually mind-boggling. But even as the first parallels were being dug, Monmouth was to get another raise thanks to the Sun King himself. A new command was awarded him in front of the Brussels gate. A report ran, "His Grace the Duke of Monmouth was designed to serve as one of Monsieur's generals, but the King, partly out of the great respect he has for the Duke, has given him the command of half the great line on this side, so that his Grace's particular command march behind the park of artillery and the bridge below Maastricht, which line contains about 8,000 horse and foot, and is a greater command than any hath, Monsieur Orleans being excepted." Monmouth would share trench duty with 4 other major generals, taking their turn as general officer in command of the trenches, being relieved at 6 p.m. every day. Monmouth would often tour the works with the king even as early as 3 o'clock in the morning. For such dedication it was written, "The Duke of Monmouth takes great pleasure to follow so great and good example, and daily gaineth not only the king's esteem, but everybody else's." It was at this time that Monmouth was joined by his new secretary, one Mr. Vernon, who took no time in writing about his master. At about 6 o'clock at the night, the horse began to march with their fascines, and upon one line the foot with their spades and axes. They advanced within half musket shot of the town. By daybreak, we had 3 batteries mounted over against the town as one comes down the river. Vernon was to be kept busy in his new appointment, and soon found himself writing a letter to the king for his master. Monmouth dictated the following: "I am now able to give your majesty some account of the siege, which is very ill for them. For I never saw people that had so great a reputation for defending themselves do it worse. The trench was opened by Monsieur de la Filiade on Saturday night. The next night, which was Monsieur de la Rochefort's, they fired a little more. I believe on Tuesday night, which is my night, I shall make a lodgment upon the counterscarp. I believe they depend upon mines, and when they are once played, we shall be quickly masters of the town. Monsieur de Schomberg is coming away, and though he is not yet certain how your majesty will have him command, he hopes you will have no one command him but the Duke of York, and that he may command immediately after." Monmouth's dispatches came thick and fast, and his reports could be mistaken for the trenches of the First World War. He wrote once more to the king, "I stopped the express on purpose to give your majesty an account of my night's trench. They have fired extremely, but I have got within 30 paces of the counterscarp, and could have made a lodgment upon it. But the king would not fear of the mines, and therefore I fear we shall not attack in these 2 days." He continues, "We have advanced extremely considering the weather. The engineers did all they could. It is such rainy weather that in the trench we are up to our knees in water, which is not very comfortable. When we are to stay 24 hours in the trench, we are then to be relieved." Yet despite miserable conditions, the mud, the digging, and the counter-battery fire, there were men desperate for action. Young gentlemen had come from England, looking for adventure and fame, had joined Monmouth's command, and now hoped that the Sun King would order an assault when it was Monmouth's turn as commander of the trenches. Some of these men were Monmouth's closest allies, as well as men who would play critical roles in the Duke of Monmouth's future. Amongst them were Charles O'Brien, the lifeguardsman wounded in the Coventry attack. For a description on that event, see our video here. Lord Arlington, Sir Thomas Armstrong, Monmouth's military and future political mentor, Captain John Churchill, the future Duke of Marlborough, Captain Slingsby, Captain Villiers of the Lifeguards, and one Louis Duras, the future Earl of Feversham, who would one day defeat Monmouth at the Battle of Sedgemoor in 1685. These young men fighting this war would appear and make their names in future wars. They resemble men who fought in the trenches of World War I and who made their name in the Second World War. Men such as Rommel, de Gaulle, Montgomery, and of course, Adolf Hitler. Whenever Louis decided he would launch the attack, it would not be a simple frontal assault. To spread the defenders' fire, he would plan 3 feint attacks, one across the Meuse, one towards the east, and the other from the southwest, Monmouth sector. Whilst this was happening, Monmouth would launch an evening attack to gain a lodgment, and for this he was given a very special formation, the French King's own regiment of foot, commanded by, wait for it, one Captain D'Artagnan. This terrifying mission was not made any easier by the physical conditions. In Monmouth's own words, there had fallen so much rain at that part of the trenches that they were full of water, in some places to a man's waist. Monmouth gave his attack force 3 objectives. The first, to attack the stakes on the palisade and to make for the covered way. The next would be a grenadier party to fill the enemy defences with hissing grenades, whilst the third would be made up of musketeers offering covering fire. The men of Captain D'Artagnan would be held in reserve. Louis ordered the attack under a thundering artillery bombardment. Monmouth and his band of men didn't hesitate. They made their way out of the sap, over the glacis, musketeers, pikemen and grenadiers, through a hail of musket fire and cannonballs, and they soon captured the covered way. Yet despite this initial success, the escarpment proved difficult to hold. But due to the continued fire from Monmouth's men, the enemy began to falter at the nearby demi-lune. Through the smoke, roar of muskets and cries of men, Monmouth, satisfied his objective was complete, he retired to his command post, under fire all the time. As ever, Monmouth was a figurehead and never seemed to falter or tire. Even during the next night, he was up and inspecting his men and their new positions. Arlington wrote, "About 2 a.m. we went out with the Duke to see what was done." The Dutch in the meantime were not slow in reacting to the Allied attack. Whilst the attackers were reinforcing their newly won positions, a Dutch soldier had hidden himself by a demi-lune and was moments away from exploding a mine. Fortunately for Monmouth's men, one of his orderlies spotted the enemy soldier and shot him with his pistol. The fuse and the powder were quickly removed. But the Dutch had other surprises up their sleeve, and just before daybreak managed to blow an underground mine. In the resultant explosion, 2 officers and 50 men were killed. Despite the devastation wrought by the mine, the Dutch struggled to capitalise on its effects. Arlington again was on hand to record the bitter fighting. Between 12 and 1 o'clock, news was brought to the Duke that the Dutch were preparing to make a sally, which they did with great order and bravery, the hand grenades falling very thick among our men. With the fighting in the balance and Monmouth's rapidly withering group in danger of being overrun, he called for reinforcements. The only men he had were the musketeers of Captain D'Artagnan, Monmouth's personal staff, and a small group of English volunteer officers. In total, roughly 70 men. It was a moment of extreme peril, and it fell on Monmouth, a lieutenant general, to inspire his men and lead an assault. There was no time for careful decision-making or slowly filtering his men through a narrow sally port. Monmouth leapt out of the trench and, sword in hand, his usually spotless uniform caked in mud and sweat, raced across the open ground. The air was busy with zipping musket balls and death all about. He shouted as he ran, "Do I have to show twice the way to the enemy?" And with that, his men, both English and French, followed him, through the battle smoke and onto the counterscarp. Arlington was there beside Monmouth, sword in hand, bloodied and tired. It was now that Captain D'Artagnan, the legendary figure of Alexander Dumas, met his end. Arlington again. Thus we marched with our swords in our hands to a barricade of the enemies, where only one man could pass at a time. There was Monsieur D'Artagnan and his musketeers, who did very bravely. He would have persuaded the Duke not to have passed that place, but that being not to be done, the gentleman would go along with him. But in passing, he was killed with a shot through his head, upon which the Duke and we passed, as well as their O'Brien, who had been shot through his leg. The soldiers at this took heart, the Duke twice leading them on with great courage. After half an hour of hand-to-hand fighting and deaths on both sides, the Dutch were finally driven off the demi-lune. And yet, it was a precarious victory. Reinforcements again were needed and called for. Monmouth sent Villiers back along the communication trench to find out where they were. Arlington, now wounded, would remember this moment. When those men came, our enemy left us without any further disturbance, masters of what we had gained the night before. So that, to the Duke's great honour, we not only took more than was expected, but maintained it after we had been in possession of it, but with the loss of a great many men and many brave officers. The bill was indeed high. Monmouth's own command had suffered over 1,900 casualties. Sir Henry Jones and Captain d'Artagnan were dead, Arlington and Churchill wounded, and 3 weeks later, O'Brien died after having his leg amputated. But despite the horrifying number of dead and dying, Monmouth basked in the occasion. An officer wrote of the Duke's conduct in the trenches and went face to face with the enemy. Some old commanders say this was the bravest and briskest action they had seen in their lives, and the Duke did the part of a much older and more experienced general. The French were also not shy in their praise for Charles II's favourite son. He possessed the conduct of a general who would have commanded trenches for 30 years. 4 days later, with the other attacks suffering serious casualties, Maastricht finally surrendered. With the smoke and blood of battle still adorning the ramparts, the Dutch garrison was allowed to march out, with bag and baggage, drums beating, colours flying, matches lighted, bullet in the mouth, with pieces of cannon and 2 mortar pieces. Monmouth's secretary Vernon observed the parade, and in particular the defeated garrison's commander, the Frenchman Farrieux. The commander, wrote Vernon, saluted my Duke as he passed along, and did him that justice as to give him the honour of taking the town, telling that it was that sally of his for the defence of the demi-lune that discouraged all his men, whom it was impossible to stop from running, though he himself was at the palisades. Another regimental commander paid his respects to Monmouth and told him that they knew it was Monmouth when he sallied forward, and they imagined that he was to be followed by some great force, and thereupon called to those in the demi-lune to have a care of being cut off. Had they been assured he was no better attended, they would have ventured from their works to endeavoured to make him their prisoner. It is difficult to understand the fame that Monmouth received after the Siege of Maastricht. It made him the most famous soldier, and if his life had turned out differently, he may well have been talked about in the same breath as Marlborough, of Wolfe, of Wellington, and Montgomery. He had shown sheer personal courage, dash, elan, fighting ability, and tactical genius. Even the French were not shy in praising the Duke after his heroics during the siege. Paris, according to Purwich, attributed the victory at Maastricht wholly to the Duke of Monmouth. Lord Sunderland was also an eyewitness of the siege. He wrote, "Nothing is talked of here but the Duke of Monmouth's bravery, and that never any man had gained so great a reputation." Another observer wrote, "It be a question whether his conduct or his courage deserves a greater share in the honour of those actions." Monmouth was to become somewhat embarrassed by the plaudits, as King Louis awarded him with the colonelcy of Sir Harry Jones's regiment of horse, after its previous commander had been killed during the fighting. Monmouth was incredibly modest, as the rewards were heaped upon him. Louis thanked him publicly by saying, "I am delighted to see you after all you have done for us." Monmouth tried to brush off the huge amount of danger he and his men had been in. "We were not under particularly heavy fire, Your Majesty." It must have been such a sweet moment when the great Sun King replied, "It is very modest of you to say so, but we saw for ourselves." So Monmouth was at the very summit of his fame and fortune. He could do no wrong at home and abroad. But the future was also looking brighter for another, a man who would go on to be perhaps Britain's greatest military commander, a man who was the ancestor of Sir Winston Churchill. It was John Churchill, the future Duke of Marlborough. Churchill's exploits were almost as famous as Monmouth's, and when congratulated by King Charles, Monmouth was to report that Churchill's conduct had been excellent, and at one point had saved his life. This personal endorsement was the main reason that Churchill was given the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, and the Duke of York made him Gentleman of the Bedchamber and Master of the Robes. Monmouth and Churchill were best friends and comrades in arms, a bond forged in blood and at the point of the sword. And yet 12 years later, they would find themselves on opposite sides of the battlefield. It is one of the most melancholy aspects of Monmouth's life. So the brutal siege and capture of Maastricht concludes the first chapter of James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth's life. He has certainly come an incredible way from his uncertain birth in exile to a king without a crown. His life will continue to blossom over the next few years. His ears will ring with a crowd chanting, "A Monmouth! God bless the Protestant Duke!" And yet dark motives and sinister characters will begin to use Monmouth for their own desperate means. His life will continue to see success and fame, but his slide into infamy will never be far behind. To see how the Duke of Monmouth's life began in exile to the future Charles II, click here. As always, thanks for watching.